This video is about the process of bibliography. One very relevant quote that applies to bibliography and the general concept of the progress of science is from Sir Isaac Newton, who said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And even one of the greatest geniuses who ever lived, one of the most productive scientists and mathematicians of all time, recognized that only by understanding and building upon and adding to what has already been discovered by many, many people before can meaningful progress be made. There's really three topics I'd like to cover in regard to bibliography. The mechanical one, perhaps the simplest one, is the concept of how one formats a reference that makes up a bibliography. In Blackboard, there's a document called Bibliography Format from the GSA, which is as good as any, which gives very welcome listing of formats for each type of source, even a computer program, or how to cite a map, or a PDF that's listed online, etc. So there's a very significant number of sources of information besides the most typical, which is a journal article. So if you need to have guidance or format, the GSA reference that has been posted is a very good choice. The most important thing, I'll admit, about the bibliography, though, is not whether it follows a perfect format, but whether it meets two other rules. One of them is that it is consistent throughout your whole bibliography, that you use the same format and the same punctuation, etc., and organization throughout a whole bibliography. It should be consistent. And also the bibliography needs to, and this is the most important thing, provide enough information so that somebody can go and look up the reference that you have referred to, the item that you have included in your bibliography. And that's, that's a very essential element of science for somebody to be able to check what you have used in your paper and referenced and see whether you have properly interpreted it, or perhaps finding it that it might be very, very useful to another person just looking up in the bibliography. So really, consistency and having enough information so that a reader can easily find the reference are what's really important about a bibliography format. It is good, though, to have a reference sheet in a formal setting to provide something that'll set a format that'll satisfy anybody. But the most important thing is consistency and including enough information so that somebody is able to find it. So that is one aspect of bibliography. Another aspect of bibliography is recognizing what is a good source, what is a reputable source. And this is worth an entire course in itself, but I'll just cover it briefly using a couple of directions. One of them is to judge what the source actually is. A source that comes from an official government site is probably quite reputable. An article that comes from a peer-reviewed, a carefully vetted article in a journal is of high quality. So there are certain sources of information that are much more reliable than others. For example, Bob's Pretty Good Earth Science webpage is maybe not as reliable a source of information as is the GSA, Geologic Society of America homepage which will point to some useful articles, or the USGS, one of the very best sources of information and highly reliable. I have a document here which is an interesting read, and I'd like to go over it briefly, which allows you which provides some means not only for evaluating the quality of the source, but of the information itself. So one thing, to find good information, you judge where it's coming from. Additionally, you look at the information itself. And this is a very interesting read, this article. It includes at the start several items of really bad information over time, including the whole scandal, so to speak, about cold fusion, etc., and various medical gaffes in the literature which had very important consequences. So this starts off with an interesting read, and this document is worth taking 15 minutes to read yourself again, but I'll go over it briefly. Signs of bad science. For instance, number one listed here is if the scientist goes directly to the general media with the discovery rather than going through scientific review and careful study inside of the science world itself. Somebody who goes straight to a press conference or publishes in the National Enquirer is automatically suspect, because it suggests that they don't have the ability to defend their work against real scientists. And that was the case of the cold fusion discovery. Anybody who says that they have something really wonderful, but it's going to be suppressed by the establishment, that is generally completely incredible. And they say that usually it's suppressed because rich parts of the establishment want to protect. Really, any valuable commercial discovery will make a lot more money for somebody and will therefore be welcomed. It's also very tricky if and very questionable if the results are at a barely detectable level. If the evidence for this discovery is very, very marginal. We also, as scientists, do not like anecdotal evidence, meaning based just on stories or personal experience. The classic being, my grandfather smoked a cigar every day and yet lived to 104. That's anecdotal evidence, and that's not as reliable. If somebody says that it has stood the test of time and endured for centuries, such as alternative medicine, some of which turns out to have some validity, but then only after going through the scientific process. Generally, many of these things are not reputable. As I said it earlier in this video, typically scientists work together and build on existing work. So somebody who pops out of a garage laboratory with an amazing discovery has likely not covered the whole picture. And finally, if the discovery requires a new law of nature or a change in the laws of nature, that makes people very uncomfortable, although at times in history new laws have been discovered, quantum mechanics, relativity, and other remarkable things, but they're few and far between and very important and very well proved before they're accepted. So there are ways to be skeptical and to discover and to find to judge one's sources. The third thing that I'd like to reiterate in a bibliography discussion is to be very, very cautious about plagiarism. Plagiarism is not always as simple as copying one thing and putting your name on it. If you just take somebody's idea or concept, it should be cited, it should be referenced. The important thing that helps to avoid plagiarism is to be fair and don't represent somebody else's thoughts or work as your own. So there is a gray area, and that tends to be ideas that have entered the, so perhaps for lack of a term right now, the public domain, like gravity. One can talk about gravity without having to find some way to source Newton's original ideas about gravity. It's an accepted textbook part of science. It's not somebody else's personal information. It's now owned by science in general. So that's a gray area, and some people may oversight, and one has to realize that if it's somebody else's personal information, then it really needs to be, or somebody else's personal discovery, it really needs to be cited. If it's generally accepted and recognized, taught in classes in every textbook, then it's something that is assumed that every scientist in the field knows. It doesn't have to be cited. So the three things that I want to summarize about bibliography: one is to establish a format following consistency and findability. Another thing is to judge sources, both by where you find information and what the information is. And finally, to avoid plagiarism. So that's the extent of the bibliography for this small course in writing.